Welcome everyone. My name is Sheila Cook with 3LM and we are doing a webinar tonight with Bruce Kirk. And our topic is designing paddocks to fit the landscape. We're recording this session. It's the 19th of July 2020. And I just want to get started by asking you, what country do you live in? And we're using the chat to communicate with each other. And if you take your mouse and hover over the bottom of Zoom, you should be able to find a chat window. And I want you to just look at this very wide variety of countries that are represented. UK, France, Belgium, Uruguay, Ireland, Canada. Many people are coming in from many different places. It's great to have all of you here tonight. And I'm so delighted to have Bruce Kirk, and he's a landscape designer and planner with Green Curves. And he really synthesizes together keyline design, permaculture, and his own deep knowledge of ecology, and then most recently holistic management. And that's how we met Bruce. He came on our holistic management training course last fall, and it was just a delight to have him in the class because of his deep knowledge on landscape design. And I'm delighted to be able to have Bruce with us tonight. I'm going to bring up another question now because it's helpful to just know a little bit about our audience. I'm going to launch this poll for you to take. From the list below, what is the top issue you are facing on your land? Or if you don't manage land directly, think about what's the top issue in your region. I'm just going to give you about 30 seconds to respond to that question. What is the top issue from this? You know, we might not have your top issue on this list, but from this list, what's the top issue that you are facing? About 2/3 of you have voted, and I'm just going to give a little bit more time, see if we can get everyone voting. For those of you new just entering, I'm asking you to choose from this list what's the top issue that you are facing. And most of us have voted now, so I'm going to end the poll and just have a look at it. So I believe you can see the top issue here is degraded soil. Nearly a quarter of people are saying that's a top issue. Next one on the list would be loss of biodiversity with 18%. And then irregular rainfall patterns, 15%. Pests, weeds, and plant disease is 12%. Livestock performance, 12%. Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. He's going to give us a presentation that's very in-depth. And how I'd like you to engage with questions is you can just type your question into chat. And I will just interrupt him periodically with questions. But he's got a lot to tell us, so I'm going to let him get started. Take it away, Bruce.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sheila, for that kind introduction. Yeah, and thanks everybody for participating. I hope I can make it worth your while. Interesting poll, because we obviously spoke a little bit before this webinar about what we should include in that poll. And one thing I added was the irregular distribution of rainfall, because it's certainly a problem that we have in my part of the world, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And it seems to be, from a designer's perspective, it seems to be something that's increasing. Everywhere I go, it seems to be not the one thing, but certainly one of the main problems that people are having now is this irregular weather, and certainly the distribution of rainwater. Okay, so my name is Bruce Kirk. I was born, raised and educated in England. I certainly spent the first part of my career in England, and then I started to travel, which led me to South America, which I fell in love with. And I've spent, I would probably say now, the majority of my career here in South America, where I now reside with my family in Uruguay. And as Sheila commented on, today's conversation is going to be landscape planning and design, which is kind of evident from the title. And excuse me if I managed to catch the flu over the last couple of days, so if I start coughing and spitting everywhere, I apologize in advance. So apart from the actual heading title there, I've also included kind of a subtitle for us to look at, because it kind of gives a bit more detail, a bit more scope to what we're actually going to be talking about. And I've been quite specific in the words I've used in this short paragraph, because it's important. So it's applying landscape planning and design to improve productivity, resilience and ecological function. And if we take that apart a little bit, the first part, applying landscape planning and design, the idea or the concept of applying something kind of orientates us around this idea that we're using a method or process to extract something to get an end result, if you like, instead of having like a blueprint, if you like, that just fits all situations. So that's quite an important part of that. Productivity, obviously everyone who's involved in any kind of human activity or process that we're interested in improving productivity. Resilience is an important part of landscape planning and design, and something that we like to focus on, because we want our designs and systems elements that are embedded within that design to have lasting resilience. Certainly, again, when we're looking at the climate changes and the other changes that are happening that people are having to deal with, resilience is quite high up on that list. And I purposely didn't use the word efficiency in here, which is often prescribed when we're looking at productivity. To increase efficiency, we're going to get an higher productivity. And the reason I haven't used that is because the idea of efficiency and resilience kind of contradict each other. So when you see an improvement generally in efficiency, you see a lack, or you see a lessening of resilience in that system. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And finally, the ecological function. This is something that we should all be concerned or interested in, because this is basically what allows life it creates the kind of conditions for life, if you like. So these ecological functions, some of them that we all know about, these are what create the conditions for the current conditions that we all live in. So we should also be concerned about these. So within that kind of subheading there, we've got a pretty articulated idea of what we're going to be dealing with, kind of the essence of what we're going to be looking at today. The other thing to look at is that when you see this together, you know, people often think about this is how can we increase productivity, resilience, but not decrease or damage ecological function. Obviously, these are often seen as being a product or an outcome of that. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that it's necessarily true. And that's what we're going to talk about. That's kind of the essence of what we're going to discuss today. Okay, so I've said that, how did I come to this conclusion? It's not really my conclusion, but it was certainly an epiphany of mine at a certain point in my career, where I suddenly realized that it's not a contradiction to say that we can have our cake and eat it, if you like. You know, we can have very productive landscapes that are also supporting and maintaining biological and ecological function, while at the same time very resilient. You know, we can have all that. There is no contradiction there. And part of my realization was coming from an ecology background, and I worked a lot with restoration ecology, and I got some of that work involved with that work was kind of separating or segregating areas of land for protection. That was the kind of mindset when I first started my job, that the only way we're going to maintain any kind of ecological function was to separate areas of land and protect them, and kind of manage and limit human activity within that. And during some of my career, we quickly realized that this wasn't working. And the reason for that, or one of the reasons for that, is because actually biological systems require our participation. They require our interaction. We should be interacting with the landscapes. We shouldn't be separating these areas off. And therefore, where can we focus, or where did I want to focus my kind of skills, if you like, in really restoring ecology? And I decided that it's in agriculture that we should be looking, because this is where human interaction is causing probably the most problems, but at the same time, it's vast areas of land. So this is kind of what led me through a journey which a lot of people in my profession have gone through. So they start to look for answers and ways to re-educate, if you like, and learn how to do that. So I've kind of listed the 4 things that have been that have affected me the most during my career. So permaculture and keyline land planning system, which we're going to talk about tonight, and holistic management, which is also now a big part of my job. I've just added a question. I'm just going to go through, as Sheila said, there's a lot of information in this presentation, so I'm going to kind of skip through as much as possible to get us to a point, and then we can kind of redirect and reorientate ourselves to certain parts of the presentation and go back. So this is a question I always like to ask, certainly clients, but also I base most of my relationships on this, and I really don't like to understand what motivates people. I'm not really interested in what people say they do or what people believe in. I'm interested in what people actually do. And so this is a very interesting question to ask people, and I can answer this very quickly in what we've just discussed. My purpose, my passion comes from applying my knowledge, certainly the ecological kind of background that I have in designing landscapes so that they are regenerative and they support all the things that we've already kind of discussed. Okay, so I've just outlined
Bruce,
yes.
I just want to point that I've put that question into chat, and Bruce really would like to hear from you. It shapes his understanding of who he's talking to. So let's just give everyone a chance to reflect. This is quite a big question. You know, what motivates you? What gets you out of bed in the morning is what he told me. How else do you think of that question, Bruce? What are you after with what motivates you?
Because it's where passion lies. It's where, you know, if you meet someone who's very passionate about what they do, this is what motivates them. This is what gets them out of bed in the morning. I mean, we all have to get out of bed in the morning, with the exception of very few. But you know, how many people are actually getting out of bed because they have to, because they're engaged in something that they feel? And I understand there's a lot of people that don't have choice, but the people who are really interested are the people who get things moving, are the people who are passionate, and they align themselves with that passion and motivation. And they're also, I would say, maybe lucky enough to be able to earn a living from that, which is where I find myself. You know, I can earn my living from the passion and the meaning that I find in my job.
So I'm going to read some of these to give you a flavor. So we've got serving people, taking care of the land, more biodiversity, positive impact, making a difference, the need to change from 35 years of extractive land management, learn to facilitate the restoration of landscapes and communities, give grasslands the space to breathe, low-cost production, working with nature, nourishment, rocking the status quo, abundant nature, making soil, observing and influencing what I observe, contributing to a mind shift, relating to how people relate to our planet and leading by example, transforming land, a family farm, changing to holistic management, educating my students and leaving my farm in a better shape than I got it. Those are some of what we're seeing here.
Great. I mean, we could kind of not so much guess whether these kind of answers would be typical of someone who would be taking part in something like this workshop or webinar. So yeah, it's great. So thanks to that input. Okay, so I've kind of articulated a basic contents of what we're going to discuss tonight. As I say, there's a lot in this presentation, so we're probably going to not so much skip through, but we might go through quite quickly certain parts of this. So we've kind of covered the personal introduction. What problem are we trying to solve? Again, this is something that's kind of specific to me, but I like to orientate myself around a problem no matter what I'm trying to do. I'm not using the word problem in its negative form. There's no reason why a problem needs to be negative. And I think as a species, we are always, well, we love to solve problems. You know, we are a problem-solving species. And for that reason, it's very helpful to orientate yourself around the things that you're trying to do and formulate them as actually a problem that requires solving. So that's why I've got this in here, is this what this talk is about, and what problem are we actually trying to solve from that. So to continue, what is landscape planning and design, why it is important. Hopefully I can introduce you to, well, I definitely will introduce you to Keyline, but maybe we can spend a little bit of time on the guy who kind of created the whole idea of Keyline and the planning and everything. Applying the process, hopefully we'll get through the applying the process, examples and designs. And obviously a big part of this will be questions and answers. So we'll definitely make time for that towards the end. Okay, so I'm just going to bring up this idea of what problem are we trying to solve, and I've kind of reduced that to this idea of merging human activity onto the landscape. It's more obvious when we're talking about landscape-based enterprises, but maybe not so obvious when we're just talking about general human activity. But when we really define it and look at it in its rawest form, everything human beings do is based on landscape at some point, even if it's not obvious. And why is this a problem? It's a problem because of the consequences if we don't do it correctly. When I'm talking about doing something correctly, I'm talking about whether we force a landscape, in this case, to accept our ideas and our plans and our vision, rather than applying them to the landscape, or merging our activities with a landscape instead of actually merging our activities onto a landscape. So there's that idea of force in there. And unfortunately, this is where we find ourselves, or certainly the consequences of which are very obvious. And we could list all those kind of obvious consequences, you know, landscape degradation, contamination, erosion, or we could just carry on listing, you know, environmental, climate change. There's a big list, and I don't think it's too far-fetched to say the basis of this is because we force landscapes to accept our ideals and our ideas, and the only reason we can do that is because we use a lot of energy to ensure that we, you know, to support it, whether it's human energy or whether it's, you know, energy in its rawest form. So I was going to start by giving you just a quick idea or a concept of this to make it a bit clearer, if you like. So here we've got kind of a general plan. It's a layout, right? And it's a layout of an urban area with some access and some sketches of, you know, this is an artist's impression, and it's not the best illustration, but I thought it would serve its purpose. And we see the world generally two-dimensionally, so our eyes allow us to see the world in a two-dimensional form. But we live in a three-dimensional world. So there's some contradiction there. And I see this in high levels of design and planning, certainly in town planning and all this kind of, I see this problem everywhere. And the fact that we try and force a two-dimensional plan design onto a three-dimensional world. And so the next image is just illustrating that kind of issue. So we've got that plan, if you like, on that right hand side, and then we've got the actual 3D, or it's a 2D image, but it gives you an illustration of three-dimensional topography. So imagine if we laid that plan directly onto this three-dimensional topographical illustration below it, and the immediate thing that would happen would be distortion at almost every level. So everything you were looking on that two-dimensional plan would be distorted. It wouldn't look the same, basically. In fact, parts of that you wouldn't even recognize. So even the forms, the curves of the lines of the road, and everything would be deformed. It would actually, in some certain aspects, would look like a crazy man had designed that, because you would see things like balanced on the edge of slopes, and just everything would be so distorted when you actually start to match the reality of something that exists with the idea or a plan that is not reality, if you like. And just to emphasize this, this is I thought we'd just go through a quick example. So this is a section of land, excuse me, And this, we're going to use this a little bit as we go through this. You'll recognize the same piece of land as we go through some different examples. So just for the sake of this example, I put 2 points on here, so point 1, point 2. And if we kind of think about point 1 as maybe being the access or the entrance to a piece of land, and point 2 being an important hub or the home of, or property on this site, or some other reason it's an important area. And we're going to look at access in this example. So if we're looking for efficiency here, what we would do obviously, because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So for efficiency, if we were looking at access across this site, we would just draw a straight line to here. I've added a little bit of texture to this map, but this is basically, and I see this again all the time, it's some of the first things that people think about on landscape design. Access, I need access, so where do I put it? I'm going to put it efficiently from point 1 to point 2 across the site. So what are the consequences of this in reality? Well, when we add profile to this, what you're looking at here is the journey from point 1 to point 2, as illustrated along the bottom. So it's a roughly 2.5 kilometer distance. So without any kind of prior knowledge and without looking at any data, we can form an idea of what that journey is going to look like. Okay, so we're going to be kind of constantly going up and down. It's kind of a roller coaster, right? We're going to be applying, if this is a primary access, by definition, it kind of needs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It needs to be accessible when we're looking at primary access. So, you know, we don't need to be too educated to see that this is a pretty roller coaster ride through here, where we're going to be accelerating, we're going to be braking. There's areas at the lower levels that are probably going to be wet and humid. So we get an idea of what that journey is going to be like. Now we've added some actual reality to that movement across the land. So what happens when we change that? And we'll go through a bit later why, what's the correct word to use? So why we've created a form like this. But for the purpose of this example, what happens if we change that route in some way and we add the profile to that? Well, straight away we can see the difference that journey is, again, without any kind of prior knowledge or too much expertise, and without looking at data. You can see that this journey is now much different. We've added 0.5 kilometer, 500 meters to the distance of that access. But when you look at the benefits that we've also gained from changing that route across that landscape, you know, it's huge. And I could probably, I did this quite quickly, but I could probably remove some of these peaks and troughs by maneuvering certain, you know, but getting more detailed with that design across this landscape. So again, I've added some more texture, so maybe people can start to see the difference between those two routes and why this other route is now looking more preferable. Now we've added some more context to it regarding the topography of that site. But if you look at it from a two-dimensional kind of perspective, this looks like the crazy route, right? This looks like the crazy designer. But when you add the real world to this and you add some context, that kind of switches. You know, and this is the start. If people start implementing access routes across their land, like this white original line, this is the start of a project collapsing, because you're not going to enjoy traveling across your piece of land in this kind of form for too long. It might be fun for a few days, but the novelty, believe me, will soon wear off. And once you start layering in how am I going to say? So if you start layering in every layer of a design onto a landscape, and you kind of keep this process up of where you're not attentive to the actual reality of the landscape that you're working with, you know, you're just layering in problem after problem after problem, and these are going to be the eventual reason why a project ceases to continue or collapses altogether. And I see this all the time, because people are spending most of their time, in this instance, for example, repairing their road, and it consumes vast amounts of energy and time and finances, and it just sucks the life out of projects. Where we can be much more practical and much more skilled in how we start to create relationships with the land itself, and create much more resilience. So let's add this resilience element into this. If this road is designed correctly and properly, and it kind of keeps this profile, this road's going to last forever, basically. You know, there's not going to be anything that's going to take this road. And there's other reasons for that, which we'll talk about. Whereas this road is a continual maintenance disaster. You know, okay. So this is quite an in-depth part of this presentation. So we're going to skip through this quite quickly, but what we're talking about here is a very incompatible relationship. And the reason it's an incompatible relationship is we're not using the context of the landscape itself to help us make decisions on where things go. And I'm lucky coming from an ecological background, because I can understand how natural landscapes are patterned because of the levels of organization that we understand, and how that creates the patterns we see onto landscapes. So all the life basically within the biosphere is not random, and all the ecosystems, communities and populations which make up that biosphere are not randomly placed. They're there because of convenience. They're there because the conditions that they require for life are maintained or are possible there, or they are there for those species to be able to exist, if you like. So there is elements of randomness to that process, but as a whole, to understand how nature is patterned, this is a good way to kind of articulate and understand that things are not randomly placed in nature. They don't grow randomly. They're there because the conditions that they require for life are provided for them in that position. So it's exactly the same principle as the axis. So we can use this concept when we're designing landscapes. That axis is in a position on that landscape that's resilient, it's going to last a long time because it's been correctly placed, similar to how ecology kind of evolves over the landscape. And it's exactly what this kind of is telling us, and I've just added some more scientific kind of understanding this. So this occupying of space is what we understand as being a niche in time and space. So these niches are occupied by species because their conditions for life are met in those niches in the biosphere. Okay, and this is just another illustration to show that, and what we see here is a patterning of a landscape with certain elements and species taking up or occupying niches within that landscape. So now we can kind of attempt to answer this question, which we've really done, but we can dig a little bit deeper on that. So what is landscape planning and design? Well, it's basically working with context on every level. So the client, the context of the client, we should know every person is an individual. Unless we treat everybody as individuals, we're not going to extract the potential that any kind of design or any enterprise could reach unless we treat people as individuals, unless we treat the project and the enterprise as an individual, unless we treat the landscape as a unique place. And it's certainly, that uniqueness is increased when we start adding more complication to that with projects and enterprises, and certainly the client. So it's working with context on every level. And the opposite to that, and I see this all the time, is where, certainly from a designer's perspective, we ignore the client, not completely, because obviously we probably wouldn't continue to work, but there's you know, a vast percentage of the time we ignore what they're actually saying. We kind of make our own understanding of the project and the enterprise that we're being told about. And landscape, well, as we've talked about, we're trying to force then our plans and ideas onto that landscape, and it's just it's a recipe for disaster. And I see this all the time as well. Okay, and this just kind of summarizes that idea. You know, if we understand how nature is patterned and what's going on, we can use that understanding in how we're applying our own ideas and plans to the landscape. Okay, so I said I would talk just very, very quickly about efficiency and resilience. Excuse me. And again, we've talked about this, but it's a nice kind of starter to look at this, is where this access. So in some respects, we've reduced the efficiency because we've made the distance longer, but that's arguable. When we actually start to layer all the benefits and we compare them, then even inefficiency can be questioned. And the reason for that is when you really look at a detailed map of the topography, you can see now more clearly where that access route actually flows across that landscape. And basically, we'll talk about this hopefully a little bit more. The position of this road or axis is basically on the ridge line of this property, where in contrast the old road just cuts straight across that piece of land, and this is why you get all this undulation and kind of roller coaster effect across this landscape. This is an easier example to look at efficiency. This is a super efficient system, right? We can plant huge areas in monocultures, homogeneous zones of annual plants, very efficient to plant, efficient to maintain and manage, and efficient to harvest. But their resilience is almost zero, very susceptible to any kind of disturbance or change, and you lose everything. Where in contrast to that, if we kind of develop more diverse systems, and this is an agroforestry system, so we have agriculture within a forestry kind of ecosystem, if you like. Here, the resilience or efficiency is slightly decreased. Arguably, it'd be harder to manage and harvest this crop. But at the same time, we've got additional crops, maybe we've got nitrogen fixation, we've got biomass, we've got protection. We can start layering the advantages in here of this system. So we've increased resilience into this system compared to the efficiency. So great. So now, what do we do with all this knowledge? Okay, so how do we apply this in the real world? This kind of leads me directly into keyline. I'm not going to dwell too much on the history of where keyline came from and who was the kind of originator of keyline, although I will tell you some information. This is information you can quickly access if anybody's interested in the history and other things. But basically, excuse me, given its correct title, the keyline land planning system was developed by a guy called P.A. Yeomans, Percival Alfred Yeomans. He was an Australian, he was a mining engineer, and he specialized in hydrology. He experienced a couple of, how would you say, well, he experienced a family disaster. His brother was killed in a fire caused by drought. He suffered where he lived in Australia, suffered from continuous drought and agricultural problems. And he was also working with soil. He was working a lot with associations who were interested in the protection of soils. So that kind of three things influenced Mr. Yeomans to develop the keyline system to kind of deal with those problems. And there's just a quick array of literature and books that Percival A. Yeomans wrote. The most common and most widely seen book is The Water for Every Farm. Although this book was actually written by his son, Ken, but it was a culmination of prior work by P.A. Yeomans, so it wasn't written directly by him. It was kind of a culmination of the work by P.A. Yeomans and put into this book. But this is kind of the most common book if you ever look at literature from P.A. Yeomans. And we have The Challenger Landscape, and then just before his death, he wrote The City Forest, which is talking about using all the process of keyline design, but in an urban environment. This is an incredibly interesting book. If you do any kind of research, and kind of trying to educate yourself on keyline, you will definitely come across these three aspects of keyline. So we have the key point, the key line, and the keyline cultivation patterning. These are probably the three most misunderstood concepts of keyline. They're often educated badly, and people commonly misunderstand each one of these things. Some of that reasoning is because of the words he used to describe each one of these things, and some of the literature that was provided by P.A. Yeomans wasn't the clearest. So there's a lot of confusion. It's very confused, a lot of this, and it's not because it's complex, it's because it can be complicated, but there's no reason why you can't understand it quite quickly. I put a note at the bottom from Regrarians Limited. I don't know, some of you might know Darren Doherty from Australia. He's a business, an enterprise called Regrarians. He is for me, or a lot of people, he's at the cutting edge of keyline land planning and design. He has taken Pierre Yeoman's work, and I wouldn't say modernized it, but he's brought it into the modern era, if you like, by changing and editing a few things. And he is, as far as I'm concerned, at the cutting edge of using Pierre Yeoman's work in a modern context. So I've made reference to him there because these images are from his book, from the Geography Handbook. So the backbone or the foundation of the keyline land planning process is what's known as the keyline scale of permanence. For me, this is the most, how would I describe, this is the brilliance of the whole keyline. If you're looking to educate yourself on just one thing in keyline, then this is it. As far as I'm concerned, this really shows the brilliance of Pierre Yeoman's, and I use it continuously or when I'm focusing or when I'm approaching landscape design. So the keyline scale of permanence or relative permanence was a result of almost 15 years of adaptation and experimentation by Pierre Yeomans, and it was about considering how we approach landscape planning and design. He was a natural systems thinker. Pierre Yeomans was a natural systems thinker, and he knew that like planning of one aspect, or the planning of one aspect in any kind of design, affects everything. So for that reason, he developed this scale of permanence based on it's a hierarchical scale. It's a hierarchical structure, and it places priority on what we should focus and spend our time on with regards to what we look at first. So here we see the kind of breakdown of the 8 fields within this scale of permanence. So if we go from the top down to the bottom, what Yeomans was saying is that it's a very difficult thing to change the climate and land shape. And therefore, these are the things that we have the least ability to change or the least impact on directly. So we should look at these things first. And as we make our way down through this kind of hierarchical list, the things at the bottom we've got more influence on, and they're quicker to change. So they're easier kind of to work with than the ones at the top. Just a quick, I talked about agrarians and they're kind of pulling this kind of information into the modern era. Well, this is agrarians' platform, and in its base has been adopted from the keyline scale of permanence. And it's important to say that there's only one keyline scale of permanence. Any other list of kind of, or fields that are similar to this that are pertaining to be scales of permanence or keyline scale of permanence, they're not. There's only one original scale of permanence, and this is why agrarians has chosen to call that their scale the agrarians platform. I've adopted this scale because I find it more, I find it broader in its descriptions of the different layers, and I find it easier to use. So, but as you can see the resemblance of each one. But like, for example, number 2, the land shape is quite specific. Water supply is quite specific, where Darren has used the geography and water. So geography is more encompassing. So there's other elements in there. So we can also look at geology. We can also look at topography. It's a more kind of embracing all-round description of what we're actually doing. And again, with water supply, we're just generally looking at water. Farm roads, access includes all the different networks of movement across a piece of land, not just a farm road. So it depends on its function, really dictates its priority in that. So we have forestry, not just trees, and fencing, which is pretty similar. And there's also the addition of economy and energy on the end of there, just which Darren uses to formalize his designs when he's working with clients. So this is a nice image of the scale of permanence, which was developed by a guy called Owen Hupsall. I always get his second name wrong. He's, I believe I'm correct in saying that he was a student of Darren. He's an American, works in keyline and permaculture design. And I also believe he's a registered holistic management guy as well. I'd have to check that, but I'm pretty sure he is. So this is nice. So if we look on the x-axis here, what we're doing here is we're dealing with time. So from less to more time. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at change of effort with respect to energy from easier to more difficult. So when we look at the same scale of permanence in here, so we've got climate, so the more time and the more effort we need when we're looking at climate, and the same with landscape. Yeah, we have the ability with machinery and other things to make modifications to landscape, but we're not talking about modifying hundreds of hectares of land. So again, land shape is very difficult to modify or to change. Water, roads, and then we get down to the easier and the quickest soil in this field, or the field of soil down here is the easiest and the least time consuming, and we can make modifications or change soil quite rapidly in either direction. As I say, the scale of permanence, there is only one, and you can see here there's some other groups of people, individuals who've adopted the scale or the permanence, the idea of the scale of permanence. As agrarians is in there, the vegetable scale, and then you can see that they've adapted them to fit their specific task. So again, we're gonna look through, because the other thing that I haven't talked about yet to do with Pierre Yeomans was he was a brilliant observer, and what he noticed in landscapes was that they're patterned. And by definition, when something is patterned, it means that there's certain things within. Well, by definition, a pattern repeats itself. So if we're looking at landscapes, for example, if we understand and we recognize certain features in that landscape, because the fact that they're patterned means they repeat themselves over and over again. And this is true for all landscapes. So the features we find in one landscape, we can see in all landscapes. And one thing that Pierre Yeomans did was create a list of specific land features that manifest or create these patterns across the landscape. And they're very useful as a designer because they help you to kind of divide up and define different things within a landscape. So what we're going to do is, if I don't know if you want to stop and ask any questions, or there's anything we need to do, or we can just carry on.
Hi, Bruce. I don't see any questions in chat, and I just want to encourage people, if they have a question, now would be a good time to put that in chat, and then let's have you carry on until we get a question.
Okay, so we're going to look at this piece of land. We're going to look at, we've gone past the kind of climate layer in the scale of permits, and now we're looking at geography. So we're going to start to look at the landscape that we're dealing with, and we're constrained in this instance by the limitations or the image that we have in front of us. And again, this is the same. If we're designing or working on a piece of land, we are going to have some restrictions and constraints, whether they're man-made or physical. So in this case, we're just going to work on the image that we've got in front of us. So this is just a topographical map. Obviously, the redder, darker areas are the higher areas. Again, I did say we're going to work on the same image. So some of you might recognize this is the route we took when we were looking at that axis route. So we've got the same piece of land, and we've got the topography of it nice and clear. So I'm just going to draw and just going to illustrate how using Pierre Yeomans' knowledge and his observations, we can start to divide up landscapes. So the first thing he recognized was that landscapes are divided primarily in what he called the main ridge. And the main ridge is a water dividing line. So I'm just going to draw that main ridge in here on this property. Now, I don't know how far this ridge extends, so I know this is part of the main ridge here because this is the division between these two pieces of land here. So I'm just going to switch over to, and the reason it's called a water dividing line, let me just change my color, is because any water or rainfall precipitation that falls on this land is either flowing in this direction or it's flowing in this direction. So this is the first kind of dividing line of any piece of land, is to recognize and find this primary ridge, this main ridge in this landscape. And it's also described as the water divide line. I'm just going to take those arrows out. Okay, so we can continue this process. by now dividing, coming off of that main ridge, and we can start looking at what was described or is called the primary ridges. Another feature within this landscape. And what you're seeing happen here is that what we're doing is we're continuing this kind of divisional process by looking at the crests, if you like, or the primary ridges coming off of this main ridge. Hopefully you can see what we're doing is just putting these lines or these ridges that coincide with the higher points on this landscape. So what we're doing here is we're developing, or we've come from, originally when we divided this landscape up with the main ridge, we divided it into two, and these are watersheds. So we've got a watershed. So any rain that's falling on this landscape, as I said, it's either falling in this direction or it's falling in the opposite direction with respect to this image. And then these become two watersheds. And then when we start to add in here the primary ridges, we're breaking down those watersheds into smaller watersheds, which is exactly what happens when we start to put these primary ridges in place. Okay, the second or the third feature we're going to add in here is, so we have the main ridge, we have the primary ridges, and then we have the primary valleys. I'm just going to do this into one valley so you can see that coming together. Okay, so what you're seeing now is that the primary valleys are starting to appear in between the primary ridges. And what you'll notice is that between every set of ridges, there's a primary valley. Okay, so this is what was understood to be patterning. Okay, so with every valley you identify, there's always two ridges either side of it. Now in landscapes, the majority of that land or that surface area is therefore ridge, because the valley is always, there's always two ridges on either side of that valley. So the majority of landscapes are always or ridge features. And ridge features shed water, because this is also, when we're looking here, the water is either going this way or is it going in this way, which we've also kind of identified, right, by putting these ridges in here. So water is always flowing perpendicular to the ridge lines. And once we start adding contour into here, so the contour lines, you'll also see that water flows perpendicular to contour. So once you kind of add that pattern and flow into this landscape, what you'll recognize is there's points within these valleys that start to hold, if you like, or start to consume higher volumes of water because of the way water flows over the landscape. So perpendicular to the contour lines and also perpendicular to the ridge line. So then we can start to pattern water flow over the landscape. So we can start layering and continue to build layers into this landscape. And the other thing we can do is we can start to work within the scale of permanence. We can start to crunch numbers and calculate what available water there is within that site. And this is why water is high up on the scale of permanence list, because, let me just flick forward so I can. Sorry, skip too far. So when we're looking at the scale of permanence, if we've done all our analysis and work on the climate, and we move into the geography layer of this process, and we start to understand the topography, then we can start to crunch numbers. And this is the reason that the next field of interest within the scale of permanence is water. We can't do anything without water. So this is why it's high up on this scale, because we need to develop, we need to articulate and understand fully where the water is flowing, how much is flowing, and what is available to us. And the other really interesting thing about the scale of permanence is that each layer interacts with the other layers and affects the other layers. So the amount of water, for example, that's available to any site is a direct relationship between the climate and the surface area of land, so the geography of the land. That's how much water is available, period. So those two, the relationship between those two is how much water is available to you on your site. And you might be nested on a very large watershed, or you might be nested in one of the smaller watersheds that we started to identify. Once you start plugging in those ridge lines and primary valleys and primary ridges, then you start to understand where your position is within that landscape. Then you can start plugging in some numbers on how much water is available to you. And then we can start to move our way down through the scale of permanence. Now, the reason that the water is high up on that list is because and this is a comment from Darren, it's one of his sayings, that we have to be blue before we're green. So we have to manage water correctly before we start to manage anything else, because nothing else is possible without water. And so this is why the scale of permanence is so important, and why we make our way through these fields in a logical, kind of hierarchical manner. So if we imagine that we've identified the surface area, and then what this is showing us here is precipitation levels, we can start to crunch those numbers, so we can understand exactly how much water is available to us. And because of the patterning of the landscape, we can also identify exactly where it is, and where it's going to be. And so all I've illustrated here is some of those kind of calculations that we've made. And these are, I've done these in a very basic way, because there's a lot of other variables involved here. So this is actual rainfall that's available on the 600 hectares, if you like, or if we want to reduce it to 1 hectare, and if just for the purpose of understanding how we come to those kind of numbers. But this is just a general idea of how you can start to use landscapes and use the scale of permanence to really understand your landscape. And then when you add the context of the actual landscape owner or manager and the enterprise itself, this all becomes very relative to that, because you can start understanding what kind of water volumes are necessary for your enterprise, where the potential is in that landscape to hold and store water if that's necessary. And this is the logical process that you should go through to extract, if you like, the most potential from your landscape. Because this is the other thing, and we'll talk about this near the end, but a landscape has a potential, and that potential exists biologically, and if it was left alone, it would run through a process known as succession. In biology, it's known as succession. So a natural process of succession is just extracting potential from a landscape, and all landscapes reach a different level of succession. And it's exactly the same. That potential exists within a landscape for us to take advantage of and extract potential from. And I don't know of anything better than the scale of permanence and Yeoman's work to do that, which is why I'm I get excited about Keyline and Yeoman's and what he's given to us as a tool, if you like, to do that. And if we ignore that, what we're doing is we're losing potential from a landscape. So if you can imagine, with the axis route that we've already discussed, if we start putting axes across our property efficiently in straight lines, and we start to go through the layer of the scale of permanence, but we don't respect the hierarchical order, so we start putting buildings and fencing and all the rest of it, what we're actually doing is not creating any kind of relationship with our landscape, and we're losing potential, which means we're losing productivity, which means we're losing resilience. You know, and this is the opposite of that, and this is why this is, for me personally, is so exciting.
Bruce, this is Sheila, and you're probably working up to this, but are you going to show us how you would design paddocks to fit the landscape on this one?
Sure. Let's just yes, certainly. So this is the same piece of land, but we've just zoomed in slightly. So if you can see, I've just zoomed into this piece in here, just to give us a bit more perspective, and I've added the contour lines to that. So if we went through the same process again, I'll do this very quickly. So we kind of start to put in here the dividing lines as per Yeoman. So we're looking at main ridges and primary ridges, and I'm just going to do that in this area here. So this ridge carries on down through here, and then I connect this. There's a small one in here. There's a ridge down here. Okay, so we've got the main ridges and primary ridges, and I'm being lazy here. These should actually join the main ridge. So we've got these water divided lines, if you like, in position. So we know now in which direction water flow is going to go during precipitation events. And we also know that with these contour lines in place, that water runs at perpendicular to contour. So we could very easily pattern water flow across this landscape and see where water's flowing. I didn't talk to you deeply about the idea of key points and key lines, but they are basically features within a landscape that we can identify where they are the most optimum for holding and storing water in a landscape and harvesting water. So if we were to identify those, they would be in primary valleys. So if we put those primary valleys in place, so there would be a key point in each one of these valleys, which is defined by the fact that they are the optimum place to store and harvest water, and that's because of the form of the landscape and because of the relationship that water flow has with the topography of the site. So if we started to identify that and where we're going to store water, and let's just say, and I apologize because we're going to speed up a little bit to get moving. Let's just say we can hold water in these positions across the landscape. If we're going to look at gravity feeding that water, we can automatically draw a line across our whole landscape now and say that everything below this line we can gravity feed. Everything above this line we cannot gravity feed. So again, designing in resilience to this landscape, gravity doesn't fail. So if I know I need to irrigate anything, I need to make sure that it's all below this line. Otherwise, I've got to start introducing technology to this system. I need to start pumping water onto the higher levels. And this is where resilience then decreases because we're relying on other things. So this is another process of design using the keyline scale of permanence and how we divide up these landscapes through that logical order. So we place water into this landscape first, okay? Not before any of the other fields, because water is the most important element on any landscape design. So that we put those systems in place first, and then we start to look at the other systems and put those in place after. So if we imagine everything below this, we can gravity feed with water. Okay, so then anything that requires water, we can simply decide that we were going to put it below this line. And this is where we start to develop the more, or bring in the more detailed parts of our design. So if we're managing livestock, for example, and we want to keep this system kind of resilient and within the confines of my own family with regards to management, and I don't want to bring in exterior energy or anything else, I want to be able to be as efficient as possible, then I'd be looking at gravity feeding everything that requires water. So any livestock management then would go below this line, unless I want to start bringing in technology. And as we discussed, we're going to lose some of that resilience from this system. So then if I'm looking at, we're going to skip ahead a little bit because the question was about paddocks. So let's pretend that we've already brought in our trees into this system and our buildings, which are a higher priority before we start looking at divisions and fencing. And they're in place, again, placed within the landscape based on the requirements and functions that they have and then they give. So if a house requires, or a structure requires water, it doesn't make sense to put it up above the gravity feeding lines, because what we're going to have to do then is lose resilience, because we're going to have to bring in some kind of technology or something to bring water up to that higher area. So again, it's almost, we're reducing our options, but in a good way, because we're correctly placing elements within the landscape according to where they should be, mimicking in effect the way ecology and biology lives within a natural environment, right? So these plants and these animals and trees and all these things, they occupy a space. We've already talked about that. Well, this is exactly what we're doing here. We're creating or understanding landscape in a way that we correctly place elements of design and then systems within that landscape, and therefore increasing resilience and being very successful because of that. So once we start layering in all the layers and we get to fencing, or we get to the kind of divisional fencing, one of the best places to place access, as has been demonstrated here with this access route that flowed across this main ridge. And the reason it's useful to do that is because the main ridge is formed in a way like this. So this is the kind of form as a profile of this ridge here. So water is either flowing off in this direction or off in this direction, which is why access routes or the position of access route is very useful to place those on a ridge. And there's other reasons. That it's usually the most, or the area with most superficial soil. So there's other reasons why to put access on ridge lines, but the main idea is the fact that it's a water shedding feature, and therefore it's not inhibited or damaged by rainfall. So the same principle applies here. We've got main ridge and we've got primary ridges across this landscape. So when we're looking at access, we're going to continue with that methodology. We're going to use these ridges as our access across this landscape. And now as we start to divide this up. So once we start applying paddocks, if you like, or areas for livestock to be managed in, obviously we need access. So it makes sense to use these primary ridges as access. And then all we do is we start to look at a paddock configuration off of that access. So we would look at, and I'm just giving you an example here. So maybe we could divide this axis up here like this. Sorry, the paddocks. Again, we don't want to go further than this line here because this is our water line, right? We can guarantee water. Gravity doesn't fail. We can guarantee water in all of this system down below here. So we want to start looking at our paddock configuration for managing livestock below this irrigation line. So we can start to create a pattern of paddocks where our principal access, we know we've got vehicle access 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on this axis up here. We don't need to worry about that. And then we've got secondary axis coming down our primary ridges, which gives us access to a vast portion of our land. Again, it's in the correct position because it's on ridge line. And then we can have a look at what our paddocks require access as well for livestock. So we can use this as an axis for livestock. So it might be a secondary axis. And then off that axis, we start to develop our paddocks. Okay, the other thing that's happening here is that we probably want, this is where we get to the area of biological function or ecological function, and we want to try and at very least protect that. So this is kind of ecologically or biologically, this is a kind of a very fragile ecological system running through here. So we've got water flow. This could be a stream, it could be a spring, it might just be initiated as a flow of water through precipitation, but it's an area of fragility, if you like, and an area that we need to protect. So we might actually take this out of the system completely and protect this as a riparian zone, or certainly as an area that could be high in biodiversity because of the ecosystem itself that exists there. So it's very humid, so therefore it's prone to be more biodiverse because of that reason. So now we've got our axes in place, our secondary axes in place for livestock management, and then we've started to develop our paddocks from that axis. We've got access to every paddock. We've taken out of the system these fragile areas, and we're protecting biological function. We've got access down through this ridge. We've got access on this primary ridge. Again, we've got access to the paddocks. And then we can start looking at adding more layers into here. So how do we provide water for each one of these paddocks? Okay, so we've already decided that we're going to feed this through gravity. And the best place to do that is down our access route. So we're going to now, I'm not going to change color, but we can apply our irrigation system for livestock. So watering facilities for livestock. We're going to put that infrastructure down our access routes, and there's reasons for that. One reason could be that we want them in an area that we've got access to, easy access. Well, we've already got the access in place, so we're layering function into one system, into one element, if you like. We've got access, which serves as a function of access, and now it's also a maintenance route as well. So we can look after some of our most expensive and important infrastructure, which is our irrigation or watering systems. They're actually placed on our, so we've got easy access to that, and we can maintain that. So this is where we would take our flow of water, and we could continue this pattern throughout this landscape. The other reason for developing paddocks like this is because in these lower areas here, it's always more fertile, so there's more nutrients and better grass growth. Everything about this area is more productive than higher up on this ridge. So once we start putting our water systems in place in these paddocks up here, and these, the majority of times what we're doing here is using portable equipment and just connecting it with push fittings. What we're doing is we're encouraging the livestock that are inside this paddock to move from the most fertile areas where they're grazing and bringing that fertility up to the less fertile areas. Now, I could keep layering more and more complexity into this design. Obviously, this would take longer, but this is the kind of process that you go through with conscious landscape design, and why it's so fundamental. Because the level of resilience and the level of productivity and the level of biological function is just, it's incomparable with what other people do when they develop landscapes. And I could go into more and more detail, but we're time restricted here.
Yeah.
You get the
Bruce,
kind of idea of the process. Yeah.
thank you so much. People are really enjoying it. I just want to let people know we're going to carry this on probably till 9:30, another 25 minutes, just because it's so interesting and we're getting a lot of valuable comments. People are really appreciating it. There are a few questions that I want to ask. The first one is, I presume there's use for the land above the water line too. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, obviously this depends on the kind of bioregion that you're in, right? So, like if we were to compare this with the UK in a temperate climate where there's kind of sufficient rainfall distributed evenly throughout the year, although this is changing and certainly not the case in the whole country anymore, then the beauty of the scale of permanence is that we don't have to use every layer. We don't have to apply, for example, because I know there's a lot of controversy with keyline, because most people believe it's to do with quite heavy and invasive earthworks, you know, developing dams and huge drainage systems, all this kind of thing. But that's only a very small part of what keyline design is about, and it's only applicable, as I say, keyline works with context. So these are the implementation of large earthworks is only a reality in a very small percentage of cases, and that's really important to understand with keyline. The idea of keyline is really predicated on this scale of permanence in this hierarchical order of how we understand and how we approach landscape design. That's, for me, the fundamental understanding to take from this. So just to answer your question, if we did develop this kind of landscape in a drier landscape where water harvesting and kind of placing that water harvesting system within the landscape as a retaining body, then we really wanted to work with that, as in respecting the gravity feed of that water. Then everything above, we would manage it just differently. So there might be times of the year where water isn't a problem because it's humid and it's raining. It might be a climate where there's dry periods of time during the year. So there'll be grass growth, if you like, pastures there that can be grazed, or it could be an area where we plant with agroforestry systems that don't require irrigation. We're not reducing our options based on the fact we cannot do something. We're reducing our options in a positive way to know what to use certain aspects of that landscape for. And I think that's really important to understand. It's not, oh, now we've got these huge areas of land we can't use anymore. No, it means that we have to use them in a different application. In fact, so that the individual elements and systems that we bring embed into the landscape, they're placed in the correct position based on the way that we've gone through this process of dividing the landscape up and understanding the land. I see many people who use these in drier landscapes, these areas above, for planting forestry, predominantly for say firewood or systems and trees that don't require any irrigation whatsoever. So these upper areas of land are just forested, and they're providing or they're productive in a different type of way that doesn't require irrigation. That's all that would mean.
Thank you, Bruce. Another question is, have you seen in your experience access roads that would have been too steep following the ridge lines, like you said?
Okay, yes. So I'm just going to flip to another. So this was going to be kind of the next slide we looked at, but what this is doing, this is a kind of a deeper level of analysis. So what this is showing us, and this is something we also do, this is showing us slope in degrees. If you look at on the left-hand side, the colors, kind of differentiate between the levels of, or the slope steepness, if you like, coming from 0 degrees up to 10 degrees. So this, again, this is exactly the same piece of property. As you can see, there's 0.1 here and 0.2, and you can see where our axis route would flow over the landscape here. And you'll also notice we're almost on 0 degree of slope, which is one reason why that. And again, if you want to look at those ridges that we identified in the landscape, just look at the white areas where there's 0 degree of slope. And then in contrast to that, what this is highlighted is in the red areas is the areas where there's steepness, which is applicable. It's applicable to us if we're thinking about using machinery and where we can't go. Access, it's great for defining access. So if we have defined areas where we're going to run our access, then we start to look at slope analysis. Some of our access might be within these yellow-red areas, and we decide to move that because it's steep within that area. So it's kind of another layer to add into this process of design. If we're looking at a place, for example, to cross over one of these lower valley areas, we can, if we look at this, these primary valleys running down through here, and eventually culminating in a larger runoff down here, and eventually joining into streams and rivers. If we wanted a position to cross from one ridge to the next ridge, this would be the area that we. So again, it's extracting potential from the landscape. It's reducing our options of where we put things, but not in a negative way. Where the only option can we cross this valley? Well, we're going to be looking in this area here, and how are we going to get there? Well, we're going to look at the ridges with the least, in this case, the least yellow and red on them, because they're going to be the least steep. So then we can start to devise, movement across this valley, but in an intelligent way, not in a way that we're forcing our ideas again onto the landscape. And what we're doing again is creating resilience. Anything we place onto this landscape is resilient, is going to last, a long time compared to if we just forced ideas onto the landscape. Does that answer your question? I can't remember what the question was. Okay, I've lost volume.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, we've got more questions. A simple one is, what resources can you recommend to someone who's just a novice or a beginner? Where would you start? What resources would you use?
That would depend on what you're looking for. Are you looking for someone who can help you with this type of work, or are you looking to educate yourself personally?
To educate yourself personally, books, websites, or other things.
Then my top recommendation would be to do some research on Regrarians Limited, run by Darren Doherty in Australia. I had the pleasure of meeting Darren last year. He came and run some courses with us here in Uruguay. He runs courses, he runs online courses, which are the REX course, which is exactly what we're doing now. It's the whole keyline approach to landscape design. Excellent online course. Darren also has got a whole host of webinars and YouTube videos. It's just endless. And the other thing he's running is it's a Facebook page, but it's specific to kind of businesses and enterprises. So it's a Regrarians page where the scale of permanence, it's actually been arranged as the scale of permanence. So there's a whole section about climate, geography, water, and everyone interacts and it interfaces on these different. So if you've got specific questions about the water layer, for example, then you can go on to that layer, and there's a whole conversations and masses of information specifically orientated for that information. And so, yeah, just Darren Doherty is the guide to research and Regrarians. Okay,
thank you. I'm just trying to skip down to some more recent questions. This applies to creating mob grazing paddocks on a wide open, non-hedge divided grazing area, for example, in New Zealand. How does it relate to, say, grazing in France, where lots of cattle farms are hedged and already divided, but can still get very dry?
Sure. Well, this is a great question, because as I say, one of the reasons I'm in South America is because of the opportunity to do the work I do, and I'm dealing with much larger, broader landscapes with very little infrastructure in place, which makes my job easier. And one of the things I've been kind of thinking about is how do we apply this to England, for example, where, as you say, in France is pretty similar, where you've got this kind of infrastructure already in place, and where you've already got these divisions, if you like, within the landscape. So I would probably repeat what I said earlier, and the scale of permanence, you can kind of go in at any layer and start to work with that. So if infrastructure is in place, unless it's an absolute disaster, so there are few cases where it's beneficial to rip that infrastructure out and start again, but only in a few small cases. But the scale of permanence is applicable. I haven't seen an opportunity where the scale of permanence isn't applicable, because it doesn't mean you have to go through every layer. You don't have to start at the top and start looking at geography, start implementing new systems of water and new access and start taking stuff out. You also need to work with what's there and how can we improve that using the scale of permanence and make things better. As far as actual paddocks themselves go, we've worked in areas where divisions are already in place, but we can certainly improve those by implementing holistic management and then devising paddocks and things like that based around the movement of those animals within that system. So it's probably an interesting or an important thing to mention is that we work in almost, I would say, 80% of our work is implementing designs like this specifically to manage livestock holistically. So we always kind of introduce that to our designs as well. So we're not designing without holistic management in mind, if you like. As far as the dryness goes, I mean, if water's a problem, then you would go in at the level of water. So we would start within the scale of permanence, look at climate and geography, and then maybe identify places where storage of water could be a possibility if that's part of the context of that project. Excuse me.
Thank you, Bruce. Another question. Is there a difficulty in creating the initial water catchment points just below the ridges on areas of designated conservation, i.e. triple SIs or SPAs? Digging holding ponds might not be allowed, for example, on downland in the UK, but holding up the water would be vital as per the slides shown.
Sure. So the thing we work with initially is because the cheapest place to hold and store water is in the soil. So the first aspect of any kind of approach to landscape design is we do soil analysis, and we look at how we can improve the cover of the soil, improve or increase biodiversity of plants, and try and improve the infiltration of water and the holding capacity of those soils, because that's always the best and cheapest option, is to do that. So it's not the first choice of any kind of serious keyline designer is to start looking immediately at how we can surgically kind of operate on a landscape and do large earthworks to start holding and storing water, because it might not be part of the context, it might not be necessary, and we look at every other possibility before we start even considering the idea of doing those kind of earthworks. With respect to permission, another reason why I'm in South America, because permission doesn't really exist here, which has its benefits, but also its negative aspects. But I know it's an issue within Europe. I work a lot in Spain, where it's a little bit more, well, there is more freedom there to implement earthworks, and it's also, we've just been talking about the necessity to do those earthworks, and certainly Spain and Portugal, there is an increased necessity to do that because of the situation that they're in with regards to, irregular weather patterns and the degradation of the soil and landscapes there is incredible. So there's more of a reason to do those there, but only once we've investigated the other possibilities and options first. But legislation and the legality of these things is definitely something that requires attention. I'm working on a project in the UK We are implementing some ponds, but these are more to do with aesthetics. But the process we have to go through is not easy, and that's for everything we're actually doing, which I actually quite enjoy sometimes, because it actually it forces you to be more creative. It's kind of easy to do my job here. In the UK, it's much more difficult. But things are starting, from what I've seen, things are starting to loosen up a little bit with regards to making or allowing people to look at making themselves more self-reliant when it comes to, you know, water and things like that on a landscape, because things are getting worse. I'm working in Cambridge, where I think it's one of the driest areas now in the UK, and most of the aquifers there feed London, and they're starting to realise now that we have to start implementing more strategies, if you like, to harvest and store water in landscapes. So it's changing, things are changing, but I know that legislation can be a problem, but I don't know all the details concerning that.
Okay, we've got more questions. Someone writes, this was earlier, very interested in the idea of moving nutrients uphill via moving livestock correctly. Could Bruce please expand on that?
Right, well, I'll be happy for you to put your experience into this as well, Sheila, but because I know you've probably got some information to kind of input into this as well. But it's just like I said, really, one of the reasons we orientate things in a certain way is to kind of, so one of the paddocks themselves, when we design paddocks, the sizes of them are not always the same size. They're always designed based on the feed that's available, the quality of the pasture that's available. So we try and equalize that over the distribution of paddocks. So each paddock basically can provide the same amount of food per animal, if you like, because of the quality of the feed within that. And obviously we're also looking at the long-term improvements. So that was why we initiate holistic management and promote that and design those systems to manage that. And like we say, we're also trying to make sure that the animals are moving nutrients from a higher nutrient area to a poorer area, and we can do that by where we place certain, again, it's about specific placement of elements within the landscape, and we can encourage the animals to do that for us instead of, you know, thinking about bringing in anything to mineralize or remineralize soils. And we can shift and we can move that around within the paddocks themselves, just by the way we manage those animals. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. What are the best mapping tools to plan these paddocks to fit the land?
Okay, that depends on the individual. So a steep learning curve, you're looking at QGIS, which is let me think if I can remember what it stands for now. So it's a computer generated system that is focused on topography. So it's a very complicated, it's a complicated system, and there's a kind of a steep learning curve to do that. So that's QGIS, which is what you're seeing, what you're looking at now, the topography and the slope analysis. This is all carried out on GIS, computerized system. If you're just interested in learning the basics, then Google Earth has got some interesting tools on it. It's not sophisticated enough, and I don't know why they haven't applied this to Google Earth, but you can't create contour lines and things like that, which is unfortunate. Hopefully they're gonna rectify that, but certainly you can do some quite interesting things with Google Earth on a very basic level. But really, if you want to learn, or certainly do the kind of work that you're looking at now, not so much with design, but if you want the accuracy and the topography and be able to work digitally, then you're looking at GIS, computerized system, you know, software. I would say, excuse me. There's also an offshoot from GIS, which is called Global Mapper, which is like a subset of GIS, which is a little bit shallower kind of learning curve. It's easier to learn, and we also use that, and that's very useful and very. I think you have to buy a license, but I don't think it's very expensive for the technology and the tool and what you're able to do with it. It's worthwhile paying for that license. So that's Global Mapper. Like some of these questions, I can also create some information sheets if you want to be a bit more detailed. So I'm not thinking thinking immediately of all the things I should be telling you with regards to software. And I can actually list some of this stuff down and give you some access points so you can gain access to this information.
Sure, Bruce, when I issue the link to everyone here, if you have some resources that you'd like to share, I'm happy to do that at the same time.
Perfect.
Another question is, in terms of moving nutrients uphill, if soil depth dictated trees for shelter can only be planted lower in very small valleys, would you have any suggestions on how to move those nutrients uphill apart from watering points?
Okay, can you just, I don't understand the question completely. So where are the trees being planted?
Yeah, what it's saying is that if soil depth dictated trees for shelter can only be planted lower in very small valleys, would you have any suggestions on how to move nutrients uphill apart from watering points?
Okay, so if the nutrients are specifically for trees, then I mean, I'm not an expert. I mean, my expertise is in landscape design, but I don't think I'm not sure the trees require that much nutrients anyway. You know, there's almost you can choose species that will grow in almost any location and in any climate. So maybe rather than trying to rearrange or change something that's more difficult to change, then maybe it's just down to species selection, and find something that's adapted to the area that you want those species to grow in, you want trees to grow in, rather than actually try and create the conditions for it. Find something that can adapt to those conditions.
Great. Next question. Would Bruce have any quick suggestions on ponds? Where best to place a pond in the landscape to maximize benefits for biodiversity?
Yes, this question I can answer. So the pond position is dictated to by the fact that that pond needs to receive a reliable source of surface flow of water, unless it's being fed from a constant supply of water. So, for example, if you've got springs, or if you've got some constant flowing water somewhere on the property, or you can kind of tap into and then have a reliable flow of water going into an area, then that's possible. But otherwise, you identify areas, which is in keyline is what we're looking at with the key point. Okay, so we're looking at specific areas of a landscape for numerous reasons are able to accept surface runoff. It's also the area where you can move the smallest amount of soil. So there's the lowest amount of earthworks in comparison to the amount of or volume of water or surface area of water that you're able to then hold with regards to that earth moving. So there's lots of reasons why key points are important. But when we're looking at maybe just smaller earthworks with ponds, sometimes we call these pocket ponds, so they're just kind of small earthworks that are used in landscapes to help infiltrate water, then topographically there are areas that are more suited to holding water than others. And that's, again, there's more reasons than one. It's actually the form or the shape of that topography is more suited to holding and storing water. There's also what's called erosional and depositional forces of water. So when water flows over the surface, it can be an erosional force. If that velocity of water is enough, it will erode soils. It will take and pick up particles, and it will erode material from the landscape. Other landforms and shapes are what's called depository. So that velocity of water is slowed down because of the form of the landscape, and all that material is deposited onto the landscape. Again, this is why key points are important, because the key points identify a position of deposition. So it's a position where material is actually, the velocity of water is slowed down, and the deposition of material is at that point, is at that key point, or slightly lower than. So it becomes an interesting area to do earthworks, because the material has been deposited there over many years. So you've got the material, the clays and the other materials to actually do the earthworks themselves. The other reason is it's an area where the velocity of water is slowing down, and the actual form and shape of the landscape is very suited to earthworks. But on a small scale, if you're just looking for areas to put ponds, then a detailed analysis of the topography is essential, and then it's just experience, then looking at that topography and understanding how water flows across that landscape, the pattern of water flow, and looking at points within that topography then where you can hold and store water because of that. And it's beneficial to do that because you can compare the amount of earthwork you're doing compared to the amount of water that you're going to hold, and compare how full it's going to be throughout the year. Because again, you don't want to spend lots of money moving a lot of earth to have a small amount of water that's only there for 3 months of the year, because the rest of the time it's dry. And again, I see this all the time. So there's lots of things to consider, and they're worth doing if you want, something that looks nice, especially because the question was orientated around biodiversity. So there's another element there. You're not just trying to provide a water source, you're trying to create something ecological, and that has certain requirements. It doesn't mean it has to be full all the time, but it's certainly, it would require more shape and more form to be able to support more biodiversity. So it's quite a specific design focus to create that.
Okay, so last question, Bruce, is if someone wants to get a hold of you to find out more, how do they reach you? Do you have a slide with your email or something?
Email would be if you want quick response and kind of direct communication, then I would be happy to do that via kind of WhatsApp or anything like that. But if you're more interested in kind of a long-term communication to exchange ideas, information, whatever, then I would say email would be the best format to do that.
Yeah, and
and please, make both of those available.
I'll just put it in the email. Great. And when you were talking about how we see in 2D, one of the participants commented, this can also happen socially. That is effectively what happened with the partitioning of India and the Middle East, where a 2D approach failed to account for societal factors leading to conflict.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting when you start to look at this in the way we perceive things, but in the way they actually are. I mean, obviously my expertise is within landscape, and I see it all the time. I'm working on a project, as I say, in the UK, and this project is a high profile job. It's a paragraph 79 project, which is a process by which people can build new houses in the countryside. And it's high profile. Basically, you need a lot of money, and you need to be able to, you go through quite a stringent process to do that. And the people who are involved are also high level designers doing this kind of work, because this is what it entails. And it's exactly how I've been explaining it. It's that everyone's doing their work in two-dimensionally, and it's a disaster. And one of the reasons I've got involved is because there's so much emphasis on water conservation, because this area is in an area of where they're experiencing water problems. So that's the reasons that we were involved in this project, or called upon. And the work they're providing, I'm probably going to get myself in trouble, but anyway, the work that they're providing is it's incredible. At the level that this work is being done at, and the work that they're providing is it's incredible, really.
Bruce, thank you so much. You gave us so much useful information, and in-depth and thoughtful. And I can see from the comments here, everyone's really appreciating it. So
maybe we should just finish by going through just a real landscape design, because it would give a kind of finish into the webinar.
Yeah. If you have something you can do in like 2 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a real example. I think this job we did a couple of years ago now, and I'll also pay some respect to my colleague Martin Beninetti, who is my associate and work colleague. So we worked on this. So this is an actual design that we went through. And these guys, their context was very interesting, because these guys basically had zero resources to pay for anything, but they owned this. I can't remember why they owned this piece of land, but I think it was family. Really nice guys, but it was an interesting context. So we had to create something that was very basic and very cheap. So all you're seeing here is kind of numbered processes that we go through. So the boundary, or the red line, is basically the boundary of the property. And you're just seeing the contour lines and then the topography. So it's an analysis here. So we're in the kind of climate stage of that and geography stage. And then we start to develop the features that we've been talking about. So here you can see the primary kind of valleys and primary ridges being identified within this landscape. And then you can start to see the development of how we're going to create this design. So this is a livestock project. The family have got cows and sheep. So they wanted a system, and they also wanted to manage this as planned grazing. So this is what the context was for our design. So here you can see the analysis work going on, and then you can see this kind of first stage of design where we start to put in, we've already dealt with climate, topography, and we've also looked at the water. So you can see that the layers being added in here. So the axis is those kind of red lines that are perched on top of the ridge there. And you can also see the paddocks. Again, as I say, they're different sizes, but they're not different with respect to the quality of pasture. So they're all roughly the same. And that's an analysis we do with the client using part of the holistic management processes. And they kind of create the scale on which they think the quality of their pasture is regarding that scale. So here you can see the division. So this is the area that they're going to start managing the sheep in. It's more intensified. And these are the paddocks. Again, you can see the same process. We've got the axis is on the ridge lines. The paddocks are starting to be divided up. And again, we've got the same process. So we're encouraging the animals to move from the lower valley areas up into the ridge areas where the axis is. And then you can see the water infrastructure going into place here, where the water, as we talked about earlier, is all being placed along. So each paddock has got access to water, and the water is being managed and maintained on those ridges, encouraging the animals to move from the lower areas to the higher areas. So this is a 3D image here, where you can see a little bit more of how that kind of looks in a three-dimensional way. And this is the kind of, so this is the final kind of design, if you like, with the additional divisional fencing going in here, because these guys were going to, I think they were going to move the animals twice a day, which is great. So this is the design reflects, again, the context of the client and how they're going to manage the area. So these areas would not include the divisional fencing or the addition of divisions in here if they were, for example, being moved every 2 or 3 days. And so we have to allow for that context within our design. Again, this is another design. I'm going to finish here. The only reason I've added this one, there's no topography here, but again, we've respected the riparian zone. So this is being taken out of the design. So this can kind of regenerate, if you like, and we can start to replenish those biological functions. And then you've got the individual paddocks being devised. Again, that if you see the topography, you could see how they've been arranged. The interesting thing to see on here is the software that we use, and we actually work within the scale of permanence. So you can see things actually laid out in the scale of permanence. It's in Spanish, I'm sorry, but so here you've got climate, geography, water, access, and trees, energy. So you can we actually work in that process as well. That's how much we kind of, and I'll just show you this finally. So this is us going through that this is a job that we've just received a confirmation on. So we're working on this. This is us working with software to develop that whole infrastructure. So it's just like, it's almost like doodling, if you like. And then this kind of concept design that we've sent now that's been accepted, this will go now to the final plans and final stages. These are the same guys who own that land. So this is us. You can just see the picture on the table there. That's the same map that we just looked at. And what we're doing here is working out the planned grazing, the holistic planned grazing. And one thing we try and encourage people to do is to work on their own plan and not let us, devise it for them and give it to them and then kind of work with it. We actually encourage them to do it themselves, which is what you're seeing here. Okay, I could go on, but I will stop.
I know you are a wealth of knowledge, and you could talk for a much longer time. But thank you so very much. There's plenty of gratitude here in the chat. Everyone appreciates so much. So thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. It really is my pleasure. This is where I get, you know, I would say I'm very passionate about this. So I don't see it as a chore at all. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for the participation.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.